What's the matter? What's wrong?
Now call your name, sound off, and move in. Geisler.
Yeah.
In the spring of 1943, a German soldier named Helmut climbed off a train somewhere in the American Midwest. He was certain he was walking into another version of the war he'd just survived. But when the mess hall doors opened, he found white bread, real coffee, and more meat on one tray than his unit had seen in a month of fighting in North Africa. Nearly 380,000 German prisoners eventually passed through American soil during the war. Almost every one of them remembered the same shock. Not the barbed wire, the food. That single detail, fed to the enemy while American families rationed their own dinner tables, sparked newspaper outrage and congressional hearings. It raised a question nobody in Washington quite wanted to answer out loud. Why were captured Nazi soldiers eating better than the taxpayers guarding them? By the middle of 1943, the war in North Africa had turned hard against Germany and Italy. When Axis forces surrendered in Tunisia that May, the Allies were suddenly holding over 275,000 prisoners, a number that would balloon again after D-Day and the collapse of German resistance in France a year later. Britain was already stretched thin by rationing and short on secure ground to hold them, so London asked its American ally for help. Could the United States, far from the fighting and sitting on millions of empty acres, take custody instead? Washington said yes. Starting in 1943, the Army launched one of the strangest logistics projects of the entire war. Men who'd fought in the deserts of Libya, the hedgerows of Normandy, and later the freezing forests of the Ardennes, found themselves shipped across the Atlantic. Not for punishment, to be housed, fed, and put to work in a country most of them had only seen in propaganda reels. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, roughly 425,000 German prisoners were scattered across more than 700 camps in nearly every state in the Union. Camps sat in the Arizona desert. Camps sat in the cotton fields of Mississippi. Camps sat in the wheat country of Kansas and tucked into the forests of upstate New York. For a lot of small American towns, watching German POWs work a nearby field became just another part of wartime life, as ordinary as the ration books in everyone's kitchen drawer. So how did an enemy soldier end up better fed than the man who caught him? The answer sits in a treaty most Americans had never read, signed 14 years before a single shot of this war was fired. The Geneva Convention of 1929 laid out exactly how prisoners of war had to be treated, and the United States had signed on. Article 11 said prisoner rations needed to match, in quantity and quality, whatever the detaining power fed its own depot troops. That meant American soldiers training back home, not men fighting overseas on combat rations. One clause. And it meant German POWs were legally entitled to eat the same food, in the same amounts, as American GIs stationed stateside. The Army took that obligation seriously, and it wasn't out of kindness. At the exact same moment German prisoners were eating 3 square meals a day in Kansas, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers were sitting in German and Japanese prison camps of their own. Washington was betting that treating enemy prisoners decently might buy better treatment for American boys in enemy hands. It didn't always pay off. In the Pacific especially, the brutality never let up, regardless of what the US did. But the logic still shaped policy for the entire war, from the first prisoner ship to the last. There was a quieter goal too. Some planners believed decent treatment could chip away at Nazi conviction, that showing a German soldier a full plate and an open newspaper might do more to shake his loyalty than a year of combat ever could. Whether that was calculated propaganda or decency dressed up as strategy, it changed a lot of men who walked through those camp gates. For soldiers who'd spent the last year of the war surviving on scraps, Arriving at an American camp felt like stepping into a different reality. By 1944, plenty of German troops were already malnourished before they were ever captured. They'd been living on a few hundred grams of bread and whatever thin soup could be scraped together some days, nothing at all on others. When those same men reached American processing centers, they got hot showers, clean uniforms, their first real meal in longer than they could remember. Former prisoners, interviewed decades later, said the strangest part wasn't the food itself. It was being asked what they wanted: coffee or milk. A soldier in the middle of a war handed a choice, and it felt almost more disorienting than the meal that followed it. The camps themselves were rows of wooden or tar paper barracks, bunk beds lined up the way you'd expect in any army facility, because most of these buildings had started out as training camps for American soldiers before they were repurposed to hold prisoners. Real mattresses, roofs that didn't leak, heat in the winter. For a man who'd spent the last 12 months in a frozen foxhole in the Ardennes, it didn't feel like captivity. It felt like a mistake someone was about to correct. Nobody corrected it. And what showed up on the plate 3 times a day is the part of this story that still sounds made up. Depot troop rations put German prisoners somewhere around 3,000 to 3,500 calories a day, built around fresh meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and dessert. That number sometimes beat what German civilians back home were surviving on under their own country's wartime rationing. Breakfast in a lot of camps meant eggs, bacon or sausage, bread and butter, coffee. Lunch, the main meal by army tradition, usually brought meat, beef some days, pork on others, alongside potatoes, vegetables, more bread. Dinner was soup, bread again, and some form of protein to close out the day. White bread left the deepest mark on a lot of memories. Men used to the dense, often gritty rye and filler breads Germany had been baking with by that point in the war described soft American white bread like it belonged to another world. And the coffee wasn't the chicory substitute Germany had switched to years earlier. It was the real thing. Prisoners kept mentioning it in interviews conducted 50, 60 years after the fact, like the smell of it had never left them. The meat numbers are what really lit a fire under American readers back home. Some accounts suggest German prisoners were eating more meat in a given week than plenty of American civilians who were living under a rationing system that limited how much red meat a family could even buy. Picture a mother in Ohio clipping her ration coupons for a small cut of beef, while a few miles away, behind a fence, captured enemy soldiers sat down to full meat portions, all of it sanctioned by a treaty her own government had signed. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. Newspapers across the country ran story after story questioning why the men who'd been trying to kill American soldiers were apparently eating better than the people paying for their captivity. Some articles described prisoners looking fat and well-fed next to lean, working American families. The complaints reached Congress more than once, and every time the answer from Washington stayed the same. The Geneva Convention was binding. Keeping American prisoners safer overseas mattered more than public frustration at home. For the prisoners themselves, all that abundance came loaded with its own weight. Gratitude was real. Plenty of men later called the food an unexpected mercy in the middle of a catastrophe they hadn't chosen. But so was guilt. Some prisoners admitted feeling strange sitting down to a full plate while knowing their families back in Germany were surviving bombing raids and empty shelves. Letters that made it home sometimes described the food in careful, almost apologetic language, aware that details like fresh meat and real coffee might land less like good news and more like a wound. Food gets the headlines, but it was only one piece of a much bigger system built around structure, labor, and something close to actual dignity. Under Geneva rules, enlisted prisoners could be required to work, as long as the labor had nothing to do with war production. And they had to be paid for it, usually in camp scrip they could spend at the canteen on cigarettes, chocolate, toiletries. Officers couldn't be forced to work at all, though a fair number volunteered anyway, just to break up the boredom. Labour turned out to matter as much to the country holding the prisoners as it did to the prisoners themselves. With millions of American men fighting overseas, the US was short on farm and factory labour at home. German POWs filled a real chunk of that gap. They picked cotton across the south. They brought in wheat harvests on the Great Plains. They cut pulpwood in Pacific Northwest forests, worked canneries and food plants, sometimes even individual family farms, often under surprisingly light supervision. That work put prisoners in regular, direct contact with American civilians, which sounds almost impossible given everything else going on in the world at that moment. Farmers who started out suspicious of the arrangement often ended up seeing the individual men working their land a lot differently than they'd expected. There are documented cases of local families sharing home-cooked meals with prisoners. Small kindnesses passed back and forth. Even friendships that lasted for decades afterward, kept alive through letters mailed across an ocean. Camp life had its own rhythm beyond the fields. Prisoners built soccer teams, they formed orchestras, they put together theatres, and in a number of camps printed their own German-language newspapers covering camp news, sports scores, and, under close censorship, whatever updates about the outside world the army allowed through. Some camps ran education programs, serious enough that a handful of prisoners later got course credit recognized by German universities after they went home. Chaplains and visiting clergy kept religious services running on a regular schedule, week after week, camp after camp. Sundays looked almost normal. Church in the morning, soccer in the afternoon, a letter home in the evening if the censors cleared it. It's easy to forget, these were men who'd been shooting at American soldiers 18 months earlier. Medical care followed the same Geneva standard. Camp infirmaries were staffed by American doctors, and in several camps, German medical officers among the prisoners were allowed to treat their own countrymen alongside them. Dental work, eyeglasses, even minor surgery got handled on base, often for free, at a level of care plenty of American civilians back home couldn't always count on for themselves. Mail ran both directions too, slowly and under heavy censorship, but it ran. A prisoner could write home. A prisoner could receive a package, so long as nothing inside it violated camp rules. For men who had no idea whether their families were even still alive, a censored letter was worth more than any meal. Money mattered in smaller, stranger ways. The camp scrip prisoners earned for their labor wasn't real currency. It couldn't leave the base, but it bought small comforts that made the days feel less like punishment. Cigarettes were the unofficial currency within that currency, traded for favors, extra bread, a turn at the better bunk near the stove. Some camps ran film nights, projecting American movies with German subtitles or narration, and prisoners who'd grown up on state-controlled newsreels back home got their first real look at how a free press actually operated. Contradictions, criticism of the government and all. None of this was uniform, and it wasn't universally pleasant either. Conditions swung hard depending on the camp, the commanding officer, and the point in the war. The politics among the prisoners themselves created real danger. Committed Nazi ideologues sometimes intimidated and, in a number of documented cases, violently punished fellow prisoners suspected of anti-Nazi sympathies. Several camps saw killings carried out by hardline prisoners against men they'd decided were traitors. American authorities eventually built screening programs to separate the committed Nazis from more moderate or apolitical prisoners. The sorting process was far from perfect. It often came too late for the men who'd already been targeted. Escape attempts happened, though rarely, mostly because fleeing a country separated from Germany by an entire ocean wasn't much of a plan to begin with. Most attempts looked more like an adventure than a real strategy. The overwhelming majority of escapees turned themselves back in within days, once the sheer size of American geography made the math obvious. One prisoner in Arizona reportedly walked nearly 40 miles before flagging down a rancher and asking politely for a ride back to camp. As Allied victory started looking more certain, the army launched a quieter program aimed at reshaping what these prisoners believed before they ever went home. Officially, it stayed vague, but everyone involved understood the goal: expose German soldiers to American newspapers, films, and coursework, and see how many walked out the other side less loyal to the regime they'd been fighting for. Special camps were set aside for this. Prisoners flagged as anti-Nazi, or just open-minded enough to be worth the effort, sometimes got pulled into university-style courses taught by German-speaking instructors. A good number of them were refugee academics who'd fled the Nazi regime themselves years earlier, teaching the very soldiers of the government that had driven them out. Historians still argue about how well it actually worked. Some former prisoners credited the program with shifting how they saw the world, describing a slow disillusionment that grew out of open debate, a free press, and the plain fact of American abundance sitting on every table. Others called it surface level at best, a few classes that never touched what a person actually believed underneath. What's harder to argue with is that the experience as a whole, food included, became tangled up for a lot of these men with the biggest reassessment of their lives. By 1946, most German prisoners had been shipped home. Some went straight back to a Germany in ruins. Others were routed through labour assignments in Britain or France first, delayed by another year or two before they finally saw home. What they carried back wasn't just memories of barbed wire and roll call. It was the strange, almost embarrassing memory of eating better as a captured enemy than they had as a free soldier fighting for their own country. And the harder question that came with it: how do you hate a country that fed you like that? Helmut, the soldier from the opening, made it home in 1946, to a Germany he barely recognized. Rationing there was worse than anything he'd known before he was captured. He told his children, decades later, that the thing he remembered most wasn't the fighting. It wasn't the cold, or the fear, or even the day he was taken prisoner. It was a tray of white bread in a Kansas mess hall, and how long it took him to believe it was real. So the next time you picture a prisoner of war camp, maybe drop the image of starving men behind wire. For hundreds of thousands of Germans held in America, the real story was stranger than that, and a lot harder to explain to the folks back home. Was it mercy? Was it strategy? Maybe it was never really about the prisoners at all, and more about the kind of country America wanted to prove it still was, even at war with the men on the other side of the fence.